Hello and welcome to this presentation. I am your host, Denise Maxwell, and I will be hosting this research symposium session entitled Millennials, Training, Modalities, and Knowledge Retention, presented by Renee Carroll. We're excited that you've joined us today to hear Renee Carroll's presentation. Your mics will be muted during this session. However, the chat window will be open during the session, so please feel free to participate or ask questions. Renee will address chat questions during the last 5 minutes of the presentation. So I'd like to welcome Renee and give you a little bit of background about our presenter. Dr. Renee Carroll has been in sales engineering and training at Windstream Communications for the last 19 years. She loves her job, but is looking at retiring in the next 9 years so she went back to school and completed her PhD in organizational leadership with a focus on e-learning and corporate training in 2017, with a goal of moving into teaching online through retirement. She is currently teaching technology courses at Colorado Technical University and Colorado Community Colleges online part-time. She also enjoys her family, hiking, team sports, and the general outdoors. Renee, we're looking forward to learning from you about what you found out about millennials in your research.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I am going to cover off today on some variance in knowledge retention specifically when discussing millennials. And I used two different modalities of training to determine which one was more powerful and led to higher knowledge retention. So we've covered the introduction. I'm going to cover the topic and why I chose this topic. I'll go through a quick literature review on it because there is quite a lot of literature out there. I'm going to let you know the methodology I used and then my findings, as well as discuss and emphasize the usability and applications around this. At the end, I'm going to cover off on a couple of things that people can do to drive this research forward. If you're looking for something to do for your dissertation or for your capstone project. And then I'll answer any questions that you may have at the end. So first, I'd like to say why. By the year 2025, about 75% of the workforce will be millennials. Organizations must consider the different learning styles of these individuals because it's different than the dominant generations of today. There's a ton of research out there that shows that, a ton of research that proves that. I did cite one of those references here for you. I also wanted to find for you what I considered a millennial because there's a lot of different definitions out there. So I did a bunch of research and I settled on from 1980 through the year 2000. You can get a little smaller with that grouping or you can get a little larger, but generally speaking, that demographic is those that fall in between the Generation X and the Generation Z. And for the purposes of this study, I looked at 1980 to 2000. So the specific problem that I was looking at, and I was a trainer in the sales engineering team here at the company I work for today. And the millennials were a completely different target audience than the average student or average employee that I would have been working with in the past. And they demanded a completely different learning environment to help me or to help them become better at what they wanted, what I wanted them to be able to do. And I wasn't getting through to them. So this was a very apt study for me in my workplace, as well as many of the people that I spoke to were excited about what we found or what we were going to find. So the purpose of the study was to determine if there was a difference in short-term and long-term knowledge retention in the millennial age group with two different learning modalities. The first was face-to-face training, and the second was online learning. Face-to-face training is how I grew up. It's what I did for most of my education and all but probably 1.5 of my degrees. And my daughter primarily had online learning. and I noticed a very different environment for her than for me. And I noticed that her knowledge retention was not as powerful, though she told me hers was equivalent, and that her preference was online learning. I wanted to be able to show her in real statistics that it truly wasn't. So I do have to admit, I entered this study with a preconceived bias. And I'll let you know here at the end if I proved it out or not. So we took a look at 3 research questions, and you're going to hear me say we a lot throughout this project, and it was a single dissertation, but as I said before, some of you probably even joined, my chair was extremely vital in getting me through this project and helped me quite a bit. So if you're going through the process now, make sure that you have a really strong chair because that can make or break your ability to get through the program. So the first research question I had was, what, if any, effect the instructor-led training versus technology-driven training method had on immediate knowledge retention? The second we looked at was long-term knowledge retention. Was there a difference in long-term knowledge retention between those 2 modalities? And then the third was, if there is a difference, was there a difference when you compared the 2 scores with each individual? All right. So methodology was really important to me, but at the same time, this was a project that was driven by a desire to finish, right? So I could have picked a very broad scope of individuals, and this project could have gone on and on and on for decades. But I needed to be able to close it out at some point. So I actually picked 40 employees of a telecommunications company because that's what I work for. And that was the audience that I had easy access to. Now, I do say easy access to, but I was given approval from the organization. And then I did get informed consent from each individual who participated because this was not a work-driven task. So I did have to go through all the process to make sure that I wasn't infringing on anybody and that they had consented. So those 40 individuals, 21 of them were placed in face-to-face instructor-led training, and 19 of them were placed in computer-based training. I conducted personally the trainings for both of those. I did the face-to-face and I did the computer-based training. The reason that I did that was I wanted to make sure that there wasn't a variance in presentation style and that the content that was delivered in both formats was the same. The individuals, those 40 individuals, had varying degrees and tenure within the field of telecommunication. Therefore, they may have absorbed the knowledge at different rates. And this may have been a limiting factor for some individuals. So I had some individuals in those trainings that had been with the company for 15, 20 years, and some that had been with the company, 6, 7 months. So there was quite a variance. I did pick 4 cities. We went to Chicago, Denver, Little Rock, and Salt Lake City. We picked individuals across all 4 cities for both modalities. This was purely based on convenience of geography and the right age grouping. You'd be surprised at how hard it is to find a good, solid group of millennials that you can actually present in front of in one of those cities where we actually have a brick and mortar office today. And I should say a brick and mortar office in 2017, because it would even be more difficult with today's time. Again, I define the millennials as those born between 1980 and 2000. And we did a quantitative quasi-experimental study. And there were some delimitations here with the study because the sample size could have been seen as small. The period between the first and the second final exam could have been seen as narrow, and I'll explain that here in a minute. And the type of individual that was solicited, because again, I just did telecommunication employees. If we had branched this out across other vertical markets or other companies, we may have seen different results, but I was very specific on who we solicited. So to give you an idea, we had a quantitative quasi-experimental design. We did an instrument of 20 single multi-coded multi-choice questions. Both modalities, the test was administered online because I didn't want to have a variance in how the test was taken. I wanted to have a variance in how the content was delivered. So it didn't matter whether you were face-to-face or you were online learning, you had administered online tests. We had 2 independent variables, and that was the training method and the time point that we measured the knowledge retention. And then the dependent variable was the knowledge retention itself, and that was measured continuously. The collection of the data was a pre-test, was deployed to all participants prior to any training to form a baseline for each individual and for both. Once the training was completed, a test was administered immediately following to both groups. So that's where we got our short term. And then 14 days later, a retention test was administered to all 40 participants again, and this was used for long-term retention. Now, you may ask why 14 days? You may feel that should have been longer. Again, 1 was convenience, 2 was needing an end date, but 3 was there was a lot of research that showed that 14 days was a good term to start looking at some long-term retention for individuals and for the way the brain works. Scores were calculated as a number of items the subject got right, and that was distributed on a scale of 0 to 20. We used birthdays for identification purposes for comparison between tests. You may wonder, what if I had ended up with the same birth date? I did actually look at that prior to beginning the study itself, and I was going to use initials if I needed to delineate further, but surprisingly, all 40 individuals had a unique birthday. I would not count on that happening again, but that is definitely what happened in my case. All the data I did store in a secure password protected file that was only accessible by me. I'm looking at some notes here in the chat. I did complete my PhD in 2017. And the reason I chose those cities was purely convenience. I had 4 cities that I traveled to on a regular basis for my job. I had access to those individuals, and I had a number of individuals that actually fell within the millennial group, and that's why I chose them. So sorry I didn't answer that question on the previous slide. I'll try and do better with chat. So what did I find? I did do a discrimination index on the test itself, checking for validity. I did have 1 question that did demonstrate a negative D value, but it was small enough that I did not need to get rid of that question. It was only found on the short-term post-test. So we left all 20 questions in. And the results indicated that the short-term delta was significant between face-to-face and computer-based training. You can see that the assessment score for the face-to-face was at 8.43, whereas the computer-based training, the mean was at 5.53. That's a pretty big variance. And then the long-term deltas, so in other words, long-term knowledge retention was even more significant, which I found very interesting. So face-to-face retention was at 7.67, and the computer-based training was at 2.32. Imagine that conversation with my daughter when I tried to convince her to start taking some face-to-face learning. But that's not the way of the future, and we all know that. We've got to find a way to make online learning, computer-based training, more effective. So that's more of what this presentation is about today. So one other thing that I did look at, just so you're aware, is I wanted to look at the potential age differences in the sample itself, because 20 years was quite a gap. And that's one of the larger generational groupings that we've looked at in the last few decades. So I did break them out between 1980 and 85, 86 to 90, and then 91 to 95. I did not have anyone that fell in the 96 to 2000 category. So between those 3 categories that I did have someone fall in, I broke them into 3 smaller groups. And I found that there was no difference in the measurements between those 3 groupings. So, final findings. It was evident from the findings that whether you were looking at short-term knowledge retention or long-term knowledge retention, face-to-face training drove more learning, knowledge retention amongst all the individuals that we tested. So what do you do with that, right? Millennials have a preference for web-based training. Companies have a preference for web-based training. Heck, all of us are teaching, or many of us on this call are teaching today, and we're teaching via web-based now because we can't do face-to-face, right? So how do we become more effective at driving knowledge retention among those individuals, millennials included, to help drive that? So we looked at a couple of things. Strategic and economic decisions to do web-based training have increased over time. My company does very little face-to-face training, and I can tell you that most companies are following the same. Many schools, I teach at a school today that has 22,000 students-ish, and I would say 200 of those take classes on ground, and the rest of them, again, 22,000, take them online. So how do you add high touch and high tech to those classroom environments? Instructors must understand the limitations of the modality, and they got to use some really creative things like gamification. Some examples of gamification would be leaderboards. We use a lot of games such as Jeopardy in the classroom today. Things that actually make it fun and get the students to be engaged, because that's what you're trying to do. You want to engage them so that they become a part of the classroom environment, even though they're sitting as you are right now, just listening to me speak. Podcasts, live webinars via Zoom. That is a great way to get people engaged. So we're doing that right now. It's way more engaging to watch someone live than if I had recorded this, say 5 times and picked the best recording just to put it out there for you. Synchronization is also huge. And this is becoming more and more prevalent in the classroom environments that I'm teaching in, as well as the training environments that I'm in. Synchronization is this very platform that we're doing right now. It's a synchronized environment where you have an open chat window and you can ask me questions real time. Other things that you can do are simple chat sessions. You can pair students together for learning purposes. You could engage quizzes, not always the best format I've found, at least not the most popular. And other ways that you can do it is you can add competition. You can have scavenger hunts. You can do puzzles and matching. Social media is huge today. I attended a conference about a year ago, and I was surprised to see teachers are using Snapchat in the classroom. I don't even have Snapchat. My daughter tries to get me to load it all the time, and I don't have it. I don't have any type of those social medias other than Facebook and LinkedIn, but they're using them in the classroom today because students are expecting them. And then labs and simulators, those are huge. I would say that virtual reality is taking off as a major player in making online learning more engaging for our learners. And I was involved in a HR conversation a couple months back, and they're using virtual reality even in those HR situations to help drive leaders to be more open to diversity in their teams. So VR or virtual reality is something that all of us need to start embracing. Let me catch up on a couple more questions here. I have never used PICR in the classroom. I'm not sure if it would work. I'm not sure what PICR is. I would have to do some research on that, and I'll definitely note that. Thanks for the tip. So I am not sure. I have not used data analysis software. Are you asking when I was looking at my findings? I actually used some systems, statistical systems in PowerPoint to come up with my analysis. All right, next slide. So what can you do from a future research standpoint. What could you do with this knowledge that I've gathered to take it to the next step? You could submit a larger study, right, with a larger, more diverse sample. You could take a look at other verticals within other industries, or just do a larger sample size. You could do a longer term, long-term retention period. So again, I looked at 14 days. There were some valid reasons that I chose 14 days. Those are outlined in the dissertation itself, but there are definitely opportunities for other researchers to look at longer term retention periods than that. You could also carefully study the face-to-face scenario to determine which elements distinguished it from the computer-based. So I was the instructor for both. I gave the same content in both. I felt I delivered it in the same format, but could you do a study in what made the face-to-face scenario more effective? Look at the two environments critically and figure out a way to augment that computer-based training program to make it even better today. I've seen some really cool things happening in YouTube videos and in new LMSs that are unbelievable, and they make you feel like you're sitting in the same room as the trainer. Could those be the elements that I was missing during the study? Maybe. Sorry, I keep missing my thing here. Oops. So the other thing you could do is, in light of the cognitive load theory, you could take a look and see if there's a how much cognitive energy is used while performing multitasking activities on the computer. This would be a very in-depth study, but it could lead to insights and find if there is wasted energy while performing tasks while on the computer that you could streamline, and that would help the learner get to the desired training level at a easier process with increased retention. So there are a lot of ways that you could take a look at the training or the study that I did and do future research on it. I did want to give you a couple of the references that I did use. These were specifically utilized in this PowerPoint presentation. I had, pages and pages of references in the dissertation itself, but these four I specifically utilized within this PowerPoint presentation. So I wanted to give those to you. And I believe that leaves me now with questions. I've given you my contact information here, but what other questions do you guys have on this presentation?
Well, Renee, you did an awesome job on keeping up with the chat as you were going through. So I think you've captured most. There is one that just came in from Irene, so you may want to respond to that.
Yeah, Irene, there's definitely quite a bit of research out there on hybrid training. I am a huge proponent for hybrid training. We actually run our entire onboarding program via a hybrid training platform. So we call it Flight Plan. And again, it's not mine. I'm not claiming any credit for it, but it's here at our company. They actually do a ton of computer-based training. Then they do some actual live synchronized web-based training. And then we actually put the students into a sim lab for a week where they're face-to-face with the instructor to drive it deeper. And then when they go back, we call it ground school, and we set them up running with more online training and follow up with live sessions. So I'm a huge proponent to hybrid. So part synchronous and part asynchronous, yep. Let's see.
So Renee, I was wondering, as a result of your study and your literature review, how are you changing your practice and your work that you do in training with millennials? What are you doing differently to target their level of engagement?
I got to be honest with you, it is really hard not to fall into a rut and do what you've always done. We're busy, we're crazy busy, right? And all of our content is developed, and it's easy to push it out in the same format that we always have. But I try to force myself, at least on a bi-monthly basis, to pick something out of my curriculum, be it for online classes for school or for training at the office, at least bi-monthly, and figure out a way to update that content or the way that I'm delivering that content to help it become more engaging.
That's awesome that you're applying it in that way.
Yeah. Someone asked if my daughter has any ideas for making it more memorable. No, I would say that she was not very helpful throughout this process. She's actually 29 now. We were going to college at the same time, which was very interesting. She was getting her bachelor's degree while I was getting my PhD. And she just had no interest in the study that I was doing other than telling me that online learning was definitely the way to go. Managing millennials, that's an entirely different presentation altogether. Charlotte, I would do a ton of research on it. They are a completely different, they have a completely different mentality, and you cannot manage them the way that us X generation individuals or baby boomers were managed. They require some hand-holding. So I would definitely suggest doing your homework because there are some great employees out there in that millennial group, and they can be very beneficial to your company, but you have to make sure that you're utilizing them to the best of their abilities. So you guys are asking questions faster than I have not seen any questions on millennials with disabilities, but I would bet there is a ton of it out there because autism has become so much more prevalent in the last few decades. That would be something I would be very interested in. I have a few friends who have specifically raised children with autism in the last 2 decades. And I could see that being an interesting study. And you could really not only get some good research out of it, but really help some good people. Yeah, let's see. My 29-year-old would have a similar reply. Yep. Generalize. How much could you results be generalized? I am not sure if it could be generalized to all generations. Again, I went in with a bias that face-to-face training would drive higher knowledge retention, but I was actually surprised to find the variance was so great because I know for me, face-to-face training is much more effective. But with all the companies moving away from it and so many schools moving away from it, I was actually surprised to find that the variance was so great. So I'm not sure that you'll find that same variance with the Z generation, because so many of the Z generation only know online learning, and they may not have the capacity, the social capacity to learn in a face-to-face environment the way that we've all grown up. So that would be an interesting study to look at in 10, 15 years. So, yeah.
Renee, I'm wondering, since your audience may be people who are working on their dissertation or thinking about doing a study, and you mentioned your chair several times. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions or tips on how you can effectively communicate or how you effectively interacted with your chair when you were doing your study.
Yeah, most definitely. I went to the University of the Rockies, and it was interesting because they kind of opened it up and said, find your chair. And they gave me a list, and I actually did a ton of research on the individuals that they gave me before I reached out to any of them. And then I proactively reached out to them, and I actually interviewed them because I knew that I was going to need somebody to hold me accountable. Because that's what it comes down to with your dissertation. I don't care how good you are or how well you know your content, you will get into a period of time where you don't feel like you're going to be able to finish. And if you don't have the right person that has your back, you may not. And you've put so much time and energy and money into it. Just get it done. Get it done. Have somebody that's going to help you through. My chair, it was Rochelle Despennett-Lee. She's a superstar in my book, and now she's a dear, dear friend. She actually forced me to sit down once a week, be it for 15 minutes or an hour. We booked it out for an hour once a week. We got together whether I had done anything or not, because then it was, hey, Renee, you didn't do anything. And I had to say that. And that forced me to hold myself accountable because we were going to meet again next week. And if I didn't do anything by next week, I didn't want to continue to have that same conversation. And there were times where my personal life got involved. They tell you never move when you're doing your doctorate. I moved. They told me don't go through any life-changing job changes. I went through a job change. Just all these things that happened, they were pretty intense. And she helped me through it. So I think the chair was probably the most important piece besides the topic, right? Because you will learn to hate your topic. But definitely pick someone that you can work with.
Well, Renee, thank you very much. I think you've got
Thank
lots
you
of
guys.
compliments in the chat from people who felt like it was a well-prepared presentation and they learned a great deal. So we appreciate the time that you put not only into your study and your defense, but also in your presentation today. So thank you very much. We'd also like to thank all of the participants for joining us today. And if you haven't heard it previously, the recordings of these presentations will be available in June to be accessed through the conference website. So we really appreciate you attending. And Renee, we appreciate you spending the time answering the questions and doing the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys all for joining, and good luck with yours.